Chapter 17 of Sabotage in Space by Carey Rockwell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Stand by to raise ship.
Connell's bull-throated roar blasted through the intercom of the gleaming projectile ship from the power deck where Dave Barrett was stationed, up to the radar bridge where Professor Hemmingwell waited anxiously. On the main deck, seated at the controls, Connell spoke rapidly into the audioceiver microphone.
Projectile vessel to spaceport traffic control, he called. Request blast-off clearance.
Spaceport traffic control to Connell, came a voice in reply to the audioceiver. You are cleared. Your time is 2 minutes to 0. Connell began snapping the many levers and switches on the control panel in proper sequence, keeping a wary eye on the astral chronometer over his head as one of its red hands ticked off the seconds to blast off. The teleceiver screen to his right showed a view of the stern of the vessel, and Connell could see some of the ground crew slowly rolling away the boarding equipment. Flipping on the switch that opened a circuit to an outside loudspeaker, he bellowed an order for the area to be cleared. The crew scurried back behind the blast deflectors and watched the ship through the thick crystal viewports.
Power deck,
Connell called into the intercom.
Check in.
Power deck, aye, reported Barrett.
Radar, check in.
Radar deck, aye, Professor Hemmingwell acknowledged in a thin voice.
Feed reactant,
Connell ordered. Reactant feeding at D9 rate, said Barrett after a split-second pause.
Energize cooling pumps.
Cooling pumps, aye.
Cut in takeoff gyros.
Gyros on, repeated Barrett. All clear forward and up, replied the elderly man.
Right,
bawled Major Connell.
Stand by.
Tensely, he watched the red hand crawl up the face of the chronometer, and he gripped the intercom microphone tightly.
Blast off,
he began.
-5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Connell slammed home the master control switch, and in an instant the silver ship trembled under a tremendous surge of power. Flame and smoke poured out of its exhaust, and slowly it began to reach for sky, straining as if to break invisible bonds holding it to Earth. Her jets shrieking tortuously, the ship picked up speed, and then suddenly, as though shot from a cannon, it blasted up through the atmosphere, spacebound. A moment later, on the control deck of the ship, Major Connell swung forward in his chair, shook off the effects of the tremendous acceleration, and called into the intercom.
Switch on the gravity generators.
As soon as the artificial gravity was in effect, the officer put the ship on standard cruising speed, changed course slightly to put them on a direct heading to Mars, and then ordered Barrett and Hemmingwell to the control deck.
Well, Professor,
he said as he gave the old man a hearty handshake.
So far, so good. She handles like a baby carriage. If the projectiles work half as well, you'll really have yourself something.
Professor Hemmingwell smiled appreciatively and turned to Barrett, who was just climbing through the hatch from the power deck. You've done as much as anyone here to help this ship get into space, Dave, he said. Thank you.
Think nothing of it, Professor, replied Barrett airily. Well, shall we begin the first series of tests? Asked Connell.
By all means, said the professor enthusiastically. If you and Dave will check the firing stations, I'll take care of the paperwork.
Right, replied Connell. Let's go, Barrett.
I'll work outside, Major, said Barrett, turning toward the airlock. You see that all the firing chambers are properly loaded.
Anything you say, Barrett.
The two men turned away from the smiling professor and left the control deck. They separated in the companionway, Connell hurrying to the starboard firing chambers and Barrett going to the midships airlock, where he put on a spacesuit for his task out on the hull. In 2 minutes, the young scientist was out on the odd-looking blisters that marked the exterior of the firing chambers ringing the hull. At each blister, Barrett examined the hollow firing tube carefully. In several, he made delicate adjustments to a small metallic ring extending from the opening of the tube. The ring was one of the most important parts of the firing unit, emitting the long-range electronic beam controlling the flight of the projectile. Meanwhile, inside the ship, Connel checked the loading of each of the chambers, making certain that each of the 10-foot-long torpedo-like projectiles was properly secured in its blasting cradle. After 15 minutes and a complete trip around the ship, the Major was satisfied that all was in readiness. He returned to the control deck, meeting Barrett on the way, and they found Professor Hemmingwell just completing his calculations for the initial test. He turned to them, waving a paper in front of their eyes. "Gentlemen," he said proudly, "we're almost ready. If you will just adjust course 15 degrees to port, we'll be in proper position for the test."
"Right," nodded Connel. "Stand by below, Barrett."
"On my way," replied Barrett, disappearing through the hatch.
"Well, Professor," said Connel, walking to the controls, "this is the big moment."
"Yes," nodded Hemmingwell. "If these rocket projectiles prove workable now, there's nothing to stop us from carrying on with our test of the ground receivers on Mars immediately." "Power deck to control deck, check in." Barrett's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom.
"Control deck, aye," replied Connel. "Ready to blast?"
"All set."
"Give me a 10-second burst on the starboard steering rockets," ordered Connel, gripping the steering vane control tightly.
"Coming up." There was a sudden jolting blast from the stern, and Connel and Hemmingwell hung on grimly as the mighty ship turned in space. Watching the control panel instruments carefully, Connel slammed home the switch that opened the powerful nose-braking rockets and brought the ship to a dead stop in space.
"On course, Professor. Ready to fire,"
Connel announced triumphantly, and Hemmingwell took his station before the giant projectile control board. "Stand by to fire one," said the professor, making a minute adjustment on the panel. Behind him, Connel unconsciously crossed his fingers. "Fire one," shouted Hemmingwell. Connel pressed a red button on the panel and waited, holding his breath. There was a distinct hissing, and then the great ship lurched slightly. On the teleceiver overhead, a white flash appeared, streaked across the screen, and then disappeared in the darkness of space. "Fire two!" Again there was a hissing sound, and another white burst of light faded into the millions of other pinpoints of lights in the black void. Over and over again, at 1-minute intervals, the projectiles were fired, until all 12 of the firing chambers had discharged their fire-tailed missiles. The professor sat back and smiled weakly at Connel. The gruff major winked encouragingly, and they both turned to watch the teleceiver screen anxiously. The gyros on each projectile had been preset for a circular flight of 15 minutes duration. Soon they would be returning, and the delicate job of bringing them safely aboard would begin.
"Here comes number one,"
shouted Connel, as a small pinpoint of light appeared on the screen. "I'm ready," said the professor. He watched the teleceiver screen carefully, made a minute adjustment of the dial controlling the directional beam emitted by the ring in the number 1 firing chamber, and at the last moment possible, snapped the remote control switch that cut the power in the approaching test projectile. It hung dead in space, immediately over the chamber. Gently, the professor increased the power of the electromagnetic ring and pulled the projectile back into the chamber as easily as slipping a hand in a glove.
"Success!" shouted Connel. "Professor, you've done it!"
"Congratulations, sir," Dave Barrett called over the intercom from the power deck. "Here comes number 2, said Professor Hemmingwell excitedly, and began to repeat the process to draw the approaching projectiles back into the ship. One after another, 5 projectiles were taken aboard successfully. Then, as he worked on the 6th, the professor began to frown. He rechecked his instruments and then shook his head, obviously disturbed.
"What's the trouble?" growled Connel.
noticing Hemmingwell's growing nervousness. "The homing ring on number 6 tube isn't working properly," said Hemmingwell. "I can't control the projectile."
"Any idea what's wrong?"
the Solar Guard officer asked. "The settings on the ring must be wrong." The professor picked up the intercom mic. "Dave," he called, "check in." "Yes, sir," replied Barrett immediately. "Did you check the settings on all the rings in the firing chambers?" "Yes, sir," reported Barrett. "They looked okay to me." "Why don't you check with Connel? He supervised their installation."
"That's true," said the major. "I'll go outside and look them over."
Connel turned on his heel and hurried to the airlock chamber. Moving with amazing speed for a big man, he donned the spacesuit in the chamber while the pressure was being equalized. As soon as the airlock portal opened, he scrambled out on the hull and made his way forward to the bulging firing chambers. Stooping over the empty tube of number 6, he examined the ring carefully and began to frown. Moving on to number 7, his frown deepened. By the time he checked the rings of 8 and 9, his face was a grim mask of anger.
"Professor,"
he called into his helmet microphone,
"check in."
"Yes, Major," replied Hemmingwell from the control deck. "Have you found the trouble?"
"I sure have,"
Connel growled.
"It's sabotage. And now I think I know who—"
Connel never finished. There was a sudden burst of power from the great ship, and the officer was hurled into space. "Major!" cried Hemmingwell. "Barrett, what have you done? Connel is outside!" "I couldn't help it, Professor," replied Barrett from the power deck. "My hand slipped and—" "Don't talk!" shouted Hemmingwell. "Stop the ship!" "I can't! The control is jammed!" As the ship surged through space and the professor and Barrett yelled at each other over the intercom, 3 space cadets rose from their hiding place in the hold of the ship. Tom Corbett nudged Roger and Astro. "You hear that?" he said grimly. "Yeah," replied Roger. "Let's go," growled Astro. Without another word, they opened the hatch and made their way quickly through the rocketing ship, each going to their separate stations, according to the prearranged plan. Roger climbed up to the radar bridge, Tom entered the control deck, and Astro burst into the power deck. "You!" Barrett cried out, his eyes wide with sudden fear as the huge Venusian advanced on him menacingly. "Get away from those controls!" growled the big cadet. "If you don't, so help me, I'll break you in two!" Barrett backed away, his face white, hands pawing the air frantically, as if he were trying to push the big cadet back. "Get over here," said Astro. "Sit down and keep your mouth shut." On the control deck, Tom was strapping himself into the pilot's chair and calling frantically into the intercom. "Give me a course, Roger." 170-degree turn to starboard," replied Roger. "I'm full ahead. I got the major on my scanner." "Pour on the power, Astro," shouted Tom, gripping the controls firmly. As the mighty ship blasted in a long, sweeping arc, Professor Hemmingwell sat numbly in his chair, aware only that the 3 cadets were taking the vessel back into the area where the remaining projectiles